Hi, this is Joseph from Nizhoniphoto.com, and today we're really going to start getting into the good stuff here. We're going to start talking about post-processing our photos in the Develop module in Lightroom. So before I really get into it, I do want to reiterate shooting in RAW. Now, I talked about this in one of the first videos, and I just want to touch on it now because it's really pertinent to the Develop module. So when you're actually shooting your photos, the two most common file formats that you're going to see when you're shooting photos are JPEGs and RAWs. And if you're not shooting in RAW at this point, I'd highly recommend that you start doing it now, especially if you want to get into post-processing your RAW files. Now, I'll do a whole separate video on RAW files and what they are and go into a little more detail, but really at this point in the class, all you need to know is that if you want to post-process your photos, shooting in RAW is going to give you a lot more information to work with. When you shoot in JPEG, your camera essentially decides, pretty much more or less, your camera decides what basic settings it's going to apply to your photo, and then it bakes those settings into the picture, and it literally cuts something like 30 to 50% of the file information out of that file and just throws it away. If you're shooting in RAW, the camera doesn't really do anything to your photo. It doesn't add any kind of in-camera post-processing, and it leaves all of that information in your photo. And the real benefit of that is that A, you have more information to work with in your file, so you can push your files further in post-processing, and B, you actually get to decide what you do to your photo. So rather than having the computer in your camera decide what it wants to do, you get to independently and artistically decide what you do to your photos. So that's why I would really recommend that you shoot in RAW. Just understand that when you do shoot in RAW, your images are going to come out really bland and they might not look that interesting. That's Again, I mean, that's the key. It's because your camera isn't going to apply any type of post-processing to it, so it just leaves it up to you. So the photos will come out looking a little washed out, a little bit dull, but that's so you can come in and do the things that you want to do to your photos and make them look really good. Okay, so let's start by talking about white balance, which is temperature and tint. Just getting right into it, we have this little dropper tool here, and what this does is you hover this dropper tool over your image, and you find a neutral gray area in your photo, and you click on that, and it's supposed to pick the appropriate white balance setting. You see what it did over here? The problem with this is really there's two big problems with this. The first problem is that it's not always very accurate, okay? Such as in this case, this image looks much too, it has too much of a green tint to it. So I can make this image look a lot better by readjusting the green tint towards, sliding this tint more towards a magenta. So that's the first problem, it's not very accurate. The second problem is that you actually want to practice setting your white balance, because the more you play around with the white balance and the more you recognize when your white balance is a little off, the better you're going to get at actually understanding white balance. And when you understand white balance, that's actually going to help you in the field, because you have an option in your camera, most cameras do, where you can choose the white balance setting in your camera. And I'm not actually talking about like the settings like sunny, daylight, the actual white balance settings. I'm talking about the color temperature setting based on the Kelvin setting in your camera. But that's a little confusing to you right now if you're a newcomer into photography, so I'm going to touch up on this in a later video. But just understand that you should really be the one setting your white balance. It's pretty simple and you should really start practicing at it, okay? So moving right along, we have temperature and tint. Now, temperature it affects how warm or cool your image is. Okay, if we slide our slider to the left, we get more of a cool white balance, meaning that it's very blue. If we slide it more to the right, we get more of a warm light white balance. Okay, so if your image looks a little too cool, you just slide it to the right to warm it up. If it looks a little too warm, you slide it to the left. It's pretty easy. Tint, again, this controls whether there's a green tint or a magenta tint in your image. Okay, to the left you got more green, to the right you got more magenta. Now, there's something to be said about the fact that there is such a thing as a correct, perfect white balance. But I feel the better way to look at white balance is you just need to uh, develop an eye for what a normal white balance is, but then also understand that you can add a lot more mood and artistic emotion in your photos by playing around with the white balance. So even though there is a technical correct white balance to your photos, keep in mind that this is an art, and essentially you just need to start making photos that look really cool to you. So just keep that in mind. Don't get too technical about white balance. Okay. Now, before we move on to the rest of the panels, I do want to talk about some really helpful hotkeys that are in the Develop module. So right off the bat, if you tap the D key on your keyboard, that's going to take you into the Develop module. So whether you're in the library or the Map module, tap the D key and you're going to be into the Develop module. Once you're actually in the Develop module, the sideways arrow keys that are to the right of the M key on your keyboard, these actually scroll through the different slider settings. Okay, it's really helpful. So if you hit the forward arrow key, or the one that points to the right, excuse me, that will scroll down. And if you hit the arrow that's pointing to the left, you'll scroll up. Okay, now, when you're actually in one of these sliders, so let's say we're in the exposure, you can adjust these with the keyboard. That's one way to do it. Me personally, I don't like doing it this way. I like adjusting all of my settings with the keyboard because I have more control and it's just quicker to do it this way. In order to adjust any of these sliders, you can hit the plus or the negative key. Plus increases the value, negative decreases. Now, if you hold down the shift key, the plus and the negative key will increase by larger volumes. So if we're at 0, the plus key increases us by 0.10. The shift with the plus key increases us by a third of a stop, pretty much, 0.33. If you hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC, it increases by a small increment. So now we're going up by 0.02 on the exposure, but it's going to be a little different for each slider. So keep that in mind. This is a really handy way to make fine-tune adjustments to your images. It's especially important when you're working with white balance because very, very slight changes to your white balance can make big impacts on your photos. Okay? Another way to actually adjust any of the sliders is you'll notice that there's a number value by all of these sliders. So you can actually go in here and you can punch in a number and it'll apply it to your image. So let's say we want 0. We're going to punch 0 and now our exposure is neutral. Okay, if we hit 1, let's do 1.0. It's going to add 0.1, which is a stop of light. Okay, we'll go ahead and just say 3. And we're way overexposed in this image, okay? Now, if we are highlighting these numbers, we can also control these by hitting the up and the down arrows, okay? And also, you can hold the shift and you can go up by larger and smaller increments, but in this case, the option key doesn't work as far as moving up and down by very small increments, okay? If you double click on the name of this of any of the tools in this in the develop module, excuse me, it will reset it to 0. Okay. You can also reset everything you do by hitting the reset button down here. Okay. So those are some helpful hotkeys that I use constantly in my workflow, and I think they're really going to help you. But another thing, going back to these numbers, those are really helpful. If you are just kind of playing around with your image, you can just remember the values in your head, and you can enter them in or delete them if you want to kind of see what different settings look like. But there actually is a better way to kind of see, like if you're going to make two different changes in an image and you want to compare, there's an easier way to do that. Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about exposure and contrast. Exposure, very simply, it increases the exposure in your image. And in Lightroom, you can increase your image by 5 stops or drop it by 5 stops. Now, this is going to be different depending on the camera that you're shooting on and the file format. I do believe that if you're shooting on an older camera that has fewer megapixels, and definitely if you're shooting in JPEG, you're not going to be able to increase your exposure by as many stops as I can here. I'm using a D810, 38 megapixels in RAW, so I have a lot more wiggle room with this photo. Contrast just adds contrast to your image. It's really helpful. You see this image right off the bat, it looks a little bit washed out. We can go ahead and add a little contrast into that to kind of get rid of that dull, washed out look. Okay. Highlights adjust exposure. That's when you're working with landscape photos, the highlights are going to be more up in the sky, whereas the shadows are going to be more down in the foreground areas. So something I typically do is I'll pull my highlights down a lot to kind of bring back a lot of the detail in the sky. You can see in this image, we're just getting a little bit more detail down here, whereas shadows will brighten up the foreground more. Okay. So you just always do this by taste, but it's never a good thing to push them all the way all the time. Okay, meaning that pulling your highlights all the way down and shadows all the way up. I mean, you can do it. It's not like it's going to trash your image or make it look horrible, but just keep in mind that you don't always have to go to full extremes on any of these sliders. Okay. Also keep in mind that when you're working with highlights and shadows, a lot of times when you're adding shadows, when you're increasing the saturation in the shadows, you might have to compensate by adding a little bit more exposure. Contrast. The next thing we'll talk about is whites and blacks. Now, I don't really know exactly. Technically, the technical definition of whites and blacks is you're setting a white point and a black point. I'm not even really sure what that means, but I can just tell you it adds a little bit more contrast to your image. So there are 2 ways to actually set whites and blacks properly. One way is to hold down the Option key, click on the slider, and now your image goes dark. And when you slide it to the right, you see what happens is we're exposing our image more when we're sliding our whites to the right. When we go to the left, we're darkening those whites. Okay? Now, when we hold the Option key, we can see, when we see these colors start to appear, that means that we're actually exposing so far that we're destroying information in our image. So if we let up, you can see that this area, like these areas here, these are just pure whites, meaning that we have lost all detail that was previously there in the image. So you don't want to do that. A good thing to do with whites and blacks is to set them to the point where you're just starting to clip information, and then pull back to the point where you're not clipping anymore, okay? Let's see, so maybe right about there. Okay, now with the blacks, you do the same thing, except in the opposite direction. The whites are going to be pulling to the right, and the blacks you're going to be pulling to the left. So the only difference is with the blacks, you can go to the point where you're clipping a little bit of information, and you don't have to necessarily go pull it to the point where there's no clipping. You can push your blacks further, because a lot of the times, let's see. Okay, like here you can see we saw that we burned out a little bit of information. Our blacks went so black that there's no detail down here, but we really don't care about that down here. There are areas in the blacks where if you don't care about losing the detail in that area, then it's all well and good. So that's one way to set the whites and blacks. Me personally, that's not my favorite way to do it. Here's how I prefer to set the whites and blacks. What I do is I tap the J key on my keyboard, and what it does is, let me show you this. Let me blow out my exposure. Okay. What it does is when I tap the J key, I can now see where my image is being overexposed. So you see here, these reds mean that I'm completely burning out the image. But in all honesty, do I really need this to tell me that this image is totally thrashed at this point? No. I could just look at this image and know, wow, I went way too far with the exposure. But when we're setting whites and blacks, this is how I prefer to do it. I tap the J key, because now I can see my image at the same time that I'm setting my whites. And it's the better way to do it, because at the end of the day, yes, the technical way to do this, technically correct, is to hold the Option key down and set your whites to the technically correct point. But again, photography is an art. It's not. It doesn't have to always be so technical. So you want to actually look at your image and judge for yourself how the image actually looks. There are some times when I like pulling the whites in the opposite direction, or the same thing with the blacks. It just kind of depends on the feel that I'm going for with the image. And by doing it this way, you actually get to look at your image while you're adjusting it. And that is by far the superior way to do it, okay? So we know with the blacks, I'm going to push these a little further, maybe to about 50. And this is a much better looking image than where I had it set before. Okay? So we can tap the J key again in order to make that disappear. Now, this is the point in the image where before you move into clarity and vibrance, once you've set your contrast, the highlights, the shadows, the whites, and the blacks, now you might want to come back to your contrast to add a little bit more in if you need more. In this case, I am going to add about another 10 of contrast into my photo. Okay. Next, we're going to go down to the clarity slider. Now, what clarity does is it adds a form of sharpening globally in your image. It's something that I use in many of my photos, but you should really use it sparingly. So with the clarity, if we go to the full extreme on it, you can see it gives us this metallic kind of industrial look to our photo. If we pull the clarity down all the way, sometimes I take the clarity out of my photo because you get this real dreamy, ethereal look in your photos. But when I'm adding clarity, I don't typically go. 20 is typically a larger amount of clarity. I typically put about at least maybe 10 to 15 in, but each image is different. Some images look good with a lot of clarity. Some images look good with just a little bit. For this image, I'm thinking 20 is good, but feels like I need just a little bit more, so I might go to 40, but 40 looks like I've gone a little bit too far. So I'm going to split the difference between 30 and 40, 20 and 40 and go down to 30, like that. Vibrance, what this does is it adjusts, as it was explained to me, Vibrance targets colors that aren't already well saturated in your image, especially blues. So if we add a lot of vibrance to our image, you can see it's really blowing out the blues and the magentas, but it's not really doing so much with the reds down here and these yellows. Okay, you want to go easy on any kind of vibrance or saturation, but again, I'll just keep repeating it. Create the image that looks good to you. So don't really worry too much about what others are going to think of it. Create an image that you're happy with. If you think it's going too far, then back it off a little bit. If you have an image where you're going for a more surreal look, then maybe pump up that vibrance. What I typically do with vibrance, saturation, and really any slider in Lightroom at all, is I tend to push it far and then back off a little bit, okay? So with vibrance, I might push it to the point where I think it's looking really good, maybe here to 50, right? But since I'm at 50, I might just back off a little bit to maybe 40 or even 35 vibrance. Saturation affects the saturation of all colors globally. So if we blow it out, all of our colors are getting way oversaturated. Again, push it to the point where you like it, and then pull it back. I think 20 looks pretty good, but I'm going to go down to 10. Now, this is pretty much it for the basic slider. One more hotkey that I want to mention that's extremely helpful all through Lightroom, particularly the Develop module, is the backslash key. The backslash key, which is on my MacBook, it's below the delete key and above the return key. Backslash key will take you to a before and an after setting of your image. So before and after. That's what the backslash key does. Now, a couple more things that I want to mention while we're talking about the basic panel. It's snapshots and history. We'll go into presets at another time. Let's talk about history first. Okay. Every time you make an adjustment in Lightroom, it creates a little history setting here. So you see, we can go all the way back to the first thing that we did on this image where it was a brand new raw image, and we can adjust we can go down to any of these settings that we've made to the image. Okay, so if we click on this one, this is our most current setting that we've adjusted. But anytime I adjust it, you see it's going to increase, it's going to reset it. Okay. Now, we just talked about the backslash key. You can the backslash key is essentially going to show you by default what the original image looked like and now what it looks like with its most current setting. If you right-click any of these history settings, you have this little option to copy history step settings to before. So you can go ahead and you can do that. And now I can make my image look a little bit normal, and the backslash key is going to show me the before settings to this history setting that I actually chose. Okay? If I wanted to go back to the normal default setting, a good thing to do is to just go to the first history setting, right-click, and click Copy History Steps to Before. Now, another thing, I'll just mention it now, but we'll really go into detail later. You can, as you see here, I have, it seems like over 100 history settings, okay? you can actually go into the preferences and tell Lightroom how many history settings you want it to remember. So you can say remember 20 or 40. Me personally, I want it to remember all of my settings because I just feel that it gives me a lot more control, and I like to have the option to go back as far as I want. However, having said that, by doing this, by allowing Lightroom to keep an unlimited number of settings, of history settings in here, over time you can end up bogging down your computer because this requires, and this pretty much takes up space or information on your computer. So if you're running with a slow machine, it might be better to tell Lightroom to limit the number of history settings that it will remember. Okay? You can clear this history setting at any time by hitting the X. Okay? But don't worry, because clicking the reset button is always going to take you back to your original setting. Okay? Now, snapshots. Snapshots are incredibly important. What a snapshot is I can make any settings to my image, and when I create a snapshot, it's going to essentially remember what I've done. Okay, it'll create this little snapshot, and now I can come back to this previous image edit just by clicking on the snapshot. Okay, I can also set this snapshot to become the before of the image. So if I set it here, the snapshot is, if I hit the before key, the backslash key, it's going to show me the before based on the snapshot. Okay. What's really a really helpful thing to do with snapshots. Hold on a sec. Okay, let's go ahead and delete this snapshot. We can rename it, or we can delete the snapshot. But a really important thing to do with it is that once you've edited your image, I like to create a snapshot of that master edit. And you can call it anything. Sometimes I call it peak. Sometimes I call it master. But I just like to create a snapshot, especially if I come into an image and I want to kind of, if I come into an image and I want to play around with it a little bit, I'll create a snapshot so that way I can do all the image edits I want, but I can always come back to that snapshot, okay? To create snapshots is really easy. One way is you can create this plus and then you can name it. Snapshots by default will also give you a time and date stamp as kind of like a default setting, if that's how you want to do it. My preferred way to do it is to use a hotkey. And the hotkey for snapshots is Command N as in Nancy, and now it'll bring up the snapshot box where I can create it. Okay, so that's pretty much all I got for today. Stay tuned for more videos and have a good one. Peace.